Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and Leap, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from eighth grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test, school, and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is when academic pressure turns into behavioral issues. But first, let's meet our special guest, Deanna Oliver.
Deanna Oliver is the CEO and co-founder of SciFlow, an AI-powered youth mental health platform that helps schools shift from reactive crisis response to proactive early support. With a background in public health and health technology, she focuses on practical systems that fit real school constraints, supporting student well-being through scalable check-ins, skill building, and clear safety workflows that reduce burden on counselors and educators. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Deanna, we are really happy to have you on the show. The topic we're exploring today is one that we have not spent enough time covering, so we're really looking forward to hearing your insights there. But before we dive into that, you have a long history in health and educational technology. We'd love to hear about your journey and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about me, I guess, on a personal level. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri. I'm a proud Chiefs fan.
It's going to be a tough season next year.
I know, but if you're from Kansas City, you know that we are like diehard Chiefs fans. So nothing will deter us
That's awesome.
from supporting them. But I actually moved out to New York City when I was 18 to go to NYU, where I studied public health. After that, I worked for a little bit, realized I didn't want to go into law. I wanted to do something a little bit more impactful. So I went and got my master's of public health from NYU as well. I was really interested in mental health specifically and how various systems such as education and nonprofits, for example, are set up to support different populations. And then I went to Cornell, where I studied health technology, so AI and machine learning applications in the mental health space. And that's what kind of kickstarted my journey working on SciFlow and building tools that support mental health for young people and students within their schools. So that's a little bit about me. Happy to answer any questions as well.
So what is SciFlow? Just tell briefly, what does SciFlow do?
Yeah. So the whole point of SciFlow is to build the infrastructure that supports organizations, namely schools, in delivering mental health support to their students and to young people. When we first started this project, and it started out as a project, just a class project, we talked to tons of people involved in youth mental health, from pediatricians and psychologists to teachers and school counselors. And it became really evident when we talked to staff that were embedded in schools that K-12 schools and universities and colleges oftentimes lack the tools and infrastructure they need to deliver mental health support to students. And you might say to yourself, well, schools aren't designed to do that. They're meant to educate students. And you'd be spot on. But the reality is that given the growing need for mental health support among young people, schools are increasingly expected to meet that demand. They're increasingly expected to intervene when there's an issue or identify students that need support. And so we essentially have developed that infrastructure to make sure that schools and community-based organizations can effectively reach those students before they reach crisis. And that's what we do, and we work with a variety of organizational types, but schools are really where we focus a lot of our energy.
It's interesting that you say that people expect that schools are focused on academics and not really mental health because, right, that is the perception, but it's never been true. It wasn't true when I was young.
Mhm.
And today, Amy and I speak with lots of school-based counselors. And one thing that's clear, it was clear before the pandemic, it blew up during the pandemic, and it hasn't changed, is that more and more of their jobs or more and more of the time that they have on site is spent handling social and emotional challenges and none of the other aspects of what counselors are responsible for. It's just it seems to have suffused their workday to an extent that is unprecedented.
You're exactly right. And, the recommended student to counselor ratio is 250 to 1. In the US right now, it's about 408 to 1. That's more contacts than I have in my cell phone, and I can't even manage those. I don't talk to everyone, right? So imagine, being one counselor where you have 400 students whose well being you have to look after. We talked to one school counselor who had roughly 1,200 students in that school, and she was the only school counselor. I mean, there's no way to manage that, and
Can you imagine?
ideally, yeah, I mean, I couldn't imagine, and the poor woman seemed so stressed out and just frazzled. And we were thankful she set aside 30 minutes to talk to us, but I don't know how she had the time. Counselors and mental health or student support services staff in schools um, are are meant to be there not just to respond to crises, but also to invest in prevention. But when your day to day workflow is so heavily focused on just putting out fires, you don't really have time to focus on prevention and reinforcing things like coping skills and emotional regulation skills. So the prevention oftentimes is less focused on, and people are just trying to get through the day, putting out fires here and there.
Let's talk about this idea of academic pressure.
Sure.
When we say academic pressure, what are we describing and what is its source?
I think it depends on the student, what academic pressure means to them, and also what the expectations are in their own family. I came from a background where the expectation was straight A's all the time. So that was what academic pressure looked like for me, but it can show up for students in a lot of different ways, depending on what those expectations are. I think um, the bigger question, I think, is how is it showing up and reflecting in kind of their behaviors and their actions when they're experiencing that academic pressure. Um, so yeah, it really depends on the student and what are the expectations set for them within the school. But I think more often it's outside the school. What is expected of them amongst their family, their peers, their friends, and sometimes their teachers as well.
I think all of those, right? We think about the standards inside the school. Do you go to school in one of these pressure cooker
Hmm.
environments where everyone is striving and sometimes behaving in a fairly cutthroat manner to get those grades? Do you come from a culture or a family where perfection is the standard and as you said, right, you just expected to get A's. However, you do that. Also, right, are you in a peer group? Do you have a lot of friends who are jockeying? And last, but definitely not least, is just the kids who are pushing themselves too much. We encounter all the time students that have unrealistic or unfair expectations of themselves. Even if their goals are attainable, the pressure they put them on themselves to achieve those goals becomes corrosive.
Exactly. And in a lot of our research, we've seen what I'd call like the perfectionism pipeline.
Yeah.
um, and
That's
there's
an interesting
data.
term.
Yeah. Um, there's a lot of data that speaks to kind of the perfectionist tendencies among students depending on what dimension is being measured, and those are oftentimes the students who look completely fine on paper. They have a high GPA, they're very compliant in classrooms, but underneath they could be suffering with a lot of anxiety, fear of failure, emotional exhaustion. So it's you know those students don't necessarily appear as the quote unquote obvious ones who need more of that support, but um, it may not kind of exhibit itself the same way.
So when first we recognize, right, there's academic pressure.
Yeah.
Academic pressure doesn't have to manifest as a behavioral issue, does it? Like it doesn't automatically blossom into something disruptive.
Not necessarily. It can show up in a lot of different ways. Disruption or classroom disruptions is just, that's just one way. But another is absenteeism, shutting down, withdrawal. what you're really looking at is like a stress response spectrum, right? So academic pressure doesn't have a single signature. It manifests differently depending on the student's developmental stage, their temperament, their home environment, their supports, or the lack of supports, right? And what you see when we're talking about kind of stress response, and academic pressure is a form of stress. Um, Students have the same kind of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn pathways that you see in a lot of trauma informed research. The fight student is the one maybe getting written up for disruptions. They're arguing with teachers. They're more defiant or getting in conflicts with peers. The flight student is the one whose attendance maybe starts slipping. They're just avoiding their environment entirely. They're skipping classes. They don't show up to school. You have the freeze student who just completely shuts down. So maybe they're physically present in the classroom, but they're emotionally and cognitively just checked out entirely. And then the fawn student kind of speaks to like that perfectionist quality, right? So this is the one who over adapts, trying to please everyone in the room, trying to please maybe parents, etc. But internally, they're just like deteriorating completely.
They stay
Um,
up all night
mhm.
studying. They are selling out and exhausting themselves.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Running
and
out
I
of
think
steam.
exactly, exactly. And what we've seen in our research and in working with schools is that there are these different archetypes of students, right, that kind of fall into these stress responses that I described, um, especially at younger ages where students are more prone to act out and verbalize, what's going on. The quiet kids, so to speak, get a lot less attention because, well, they're compliant and they're doing their homework, they're doing what they have to do. But the reality is that student could also be experiencing signs of academic pressure or emotional distress.
So you described a wide range, a really thorough range of the different kinds of responses depending on the student. I can't help but think that those are also the signs of other forms of pressure or stress or influences that are disrupting the students. Is there any way for adults to differentiate between a student acting out or shutting down because they're feeling academic pressure versus feeling social pressure or emotional turmoil or anything like that? Or does it all kind of, like, depending on the student, you just are looking for some kind of manifestation?
Um, this is a tough question. It's really important in school mental health. There's a clinical distinction between like externalizing and internalizing behaviors, but both are stress responses. They're just expressed through different channels. Um, So this question as to which path a student takes, it depends on a ton of things. I mean, some of it is just temperament and neurobiology. How is someone neurologically wired to activate under stress? And sometimes that isn't a choice, right? It's just like how your nervous system is calibrated. Some of it is environmental reinforcement. Students, especially young ones, very quickly learn what their environment rewards and punishes. So, if a school responds to distress with discipline rather than support, some students learn to suppress their distress or internalize, while others can escalate because acting out is the only way they've learned to signal that something is wrong. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
What I'm asking is if a student is acting out, say,
Hmm.
temperamentally, they will externalize their stress and they're
Yes.
acting out. Is there a way to discern whether they're acting out because of emotional pressure, emotional stress, because the person that they like doesn't like them, because they didn't make it on the sports team they wanted? Like, there's a million
Yeah.
reasons why students,
Yeah.
especially at any age in their lives, will suffer distress, will will feel off balance.
Being young is
And
itself stressful, right?
so I
Yeah.
think that, like, there's the cause and the symptoms. We understand that the symptoms show up differently based on the student. How can we figure out the cause?
Mm. So we've been trying to do a lot of that work at SciFlow. We have basically tasked ourselves with figuring out, how can we identify those early warning signs and enable schools to intervene sooner than later, or at least sooner before a student, reaches crisis. What we've found so far is that when students do feel they have a pathway to express their voice or concerns, that they oftentimes take it, right? That they need that opportunity. A lot of kids are unlikely to kind of raise their hand and indicate when they need support or when they need help. But when asked or when an opportunity is put in front of them, they're sometimes brutally honest with, kids are brutally honest, right? They're pretty
Right.
forthcoming about how they feel, but sometimes it requires making sure there is an opportunity to actually voice that. And so, for example, with the wellness platform we've been developing for schools, there's a mechanism where students can constantly access text-based support or chat-based support. There are check-ins on a daily basis. Really, we're creating those pathways for students to um, voice what they're going through and voice how they're feeling. And I think for the trusted adults in their lives, oftentimes that requires, checking in when you see slight changes in behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've noticed that more on high school campuses, like not the suggestion box, but certainly a place where either a student could put something in there to sort of alert either that another person they're observing might be suffering from something versus, or they could put something in there about themselves, right?
Right.
So it's interesting when you're saying when reaching out that a lot of these kids are very honest or very responsive. It's just they're, they just need to be asked, right? Is what it sounds like what you're saying is being asked or being followed up on can make a huge difference. Is that your observation?
Yeah, absolutely. But the other observation is that school staff are already stretched so thin. They have so many things on their plates, and like we just established, counselors already have sometimes upwards of 500-600 students, and so there are a lot of ways, like with the work that we're doing, you can use technology to kind of expand the reach of
So
of
let's kind of pursue
staff.
that. So, what does a healthy system of school based support? What would that look like? Would you say?
Yeah, so I think it really requires like the classic MTSS or multi-tiered system of supports framework that schools are using that integrates mental health really not just as like a touch point, right, but across every layer of the school experience. So by that, I mean, a single assembly on stress management or a poster campaign about calling a hotline, that's not really a system, that's just a gesture. The question is, how do you integrate that in everything that you're doing? So in practice, there are several things a school can do. One is kind of universal prevention. That's the foundation. It's including and incorporating social emotional learning that's embedded in the daily instruction, really woven into how classrooms operate. Teaching emotional regulation, stress management, across a lot of these core competencies. I spoke to a school last week that said they they incorporate social emotional learning in their history classes. There are all of these touch points and small opportunities for schools to really incorporate mental health and social and emotional well-being across the day. But then outside of universal prevention, you have things like targeted and intensive intervention. There are students who need that additional support. And so the identification methods a school is using become really, really important. What we've seen is, universal screening for things like anxiety and depression, but also assessing a lot of these indicators through data. So attendance. Maybe attendance is slipping or grades dropping, or of course, the screening scores indicating their like elevated levels of anxiety and depression. Those are all opportunities for schools to figure out who needs support and then do something about it. I guess finally, I'd say the doing something about it um, includes a lot of things. A lot of schools we've talked to are doing, small groups that are focused on CBT and check-in, check-out systems, et cetera. But also making sure that, a school has the external referral pathways for more clinical support for a student is really important. Um, across the US, we've seen a shortage of mental health professionals, especially in rural school districts. That's been a really big one where, okay, maybe they have prevention in place, maybe they have identification in place, but now that they've identified all of these students, they don't know what to do. They don't have the resources to refer them to.
Yeah,
So
and you say that in rural areas, but I would say even in my area in Greater Cleveland, yeah, when students want to reach out for services, it is really hard to find. Even
All those
schools are,
advanced athletic fields don't pay for themselves. So much of the budget goes to other resources.
but and so there's finding someone, then there's also cost, right? I mean, there's cost, very often cost involved, which is it's
yeah.
tricky, you know.
Yeah. And when we first started working on SciFlow, our focus was, well, a platform for students and the mental health teams within schools, so that they could see who needed support and what kind of support they needed. And one of our very first pilots, the school came to us and said, "Hey, this is really great. We've identified like 100 kids that need help. So now what?" So we evolved what we were doing to incorporate a provider network where now we can actually connect students to licensed clinical providers as well. That became a really important piece of what we were doing because, as we established, schools are designed for education. They can't necessarily connect every student to a therapist or psychiatrist. So making sure those pathways are in place become really critical.
So you outlined a lot of steps that schools can take to help on site detect and address behavioral issues related to academic pressure. What can be done at home?
This question in and of itself could probably be like an hour-long podcast, but um, I do think there are a couple of things that parents can do really quickly, really easily. The first is just, how do I put this? I guess uh, separating, separate your response to grades from your response to your child. Um, that is a very protective thing you can do. Um, Parents' academic expectations oftentimes exceed what a child perceives as achievable. And, the result of that isn't, motivation, it's typically anxiety. And when you have not just the academic pressure that a student has for themselves, uh, but also the school-based pressure, uh, pressure from parents, it can really compound very quickly. So the shift is, instead of why did you get a B or a C today? It's, how are you feeling about school right now? Instead of reacting to a grade, really respond to the human being in front of you and think more about the foundation they need on an emotional level to succeed at an academic level. Um, and then the second thing would probably be just learning to read more of these signals, not just the academic ones. It's not just about grade slipping, but is your child less likely to, or is your child more likely to skip school now, or say they're sick and they can't go in.
Mhm.
I know I pulled that a lot when I was in high school, um, but really looking for those signals. Outside of just grades that something might be wrong, parents are going to have the best viewpoint and line of sight into what's going on with their child. Um, on a daily basis at home, look for things or patterns that have changed all of a sudden, and that's usually a pretty good indicator. And then the last thing I'd say is just kind of normalize help seeking behavior by modeling it. Right. One of the biggest barriers we've seen for students and young people generally to access mental health support is stigma. And typically, what we've seen is that stigma starts at home. If a child has never seen their parent acknowledge stress or seek support or talk openly about emotional struggles, asking for help just feels so, risky. It's completely foreign to a lot of kids, and so parents can change that by just being more transparent, talking about their own feelings. Oh, I had a hard week at work, and I talked to someone about it. It's one of the most powerful things you can do to a child is demonstrate and model the behavior that it's okay to need or seek help or talk about, how you're doing.
I love that. So that's a really comprehensive survey of a lot of ways that all of the people around a student might be able to detect and ameliorate academic pressure or behavioral disruptions related to feelings of academic expectations. If you could speak to students directly about this issue, what might you say?
If I could speak to students directly, I'm thinking back to my time as a student, what I may have said to myself. I think one of the amazing things about technology right now is that you can access a lot of support. Um, Online, right? If you take the right pathways and you're looking for the right groups and communities, you have access to quite a bit. Back in my day, when when I don't know, I guess MySpace was still a thing that was really the only,
She's dating herself here,
I'm
Mike.
dating myself.
Yeah, believe
MySpace
me,
and Facebook.
we didn't have that in our day.
Yeah, we didn't either.
But the beautiful thing about technology is now there are so many pathways for getting support and reaching support. Whereas 20 years ago, if you were struggling with something related to your mental health, and maybe you came from a family where it wasn't accepted, it was very, very isolating. You were very, very alone. And so, for
Mhm.
students that might be listening that are struggling with something, I would encourage you by saying, there are resources out there for you. There are communities and groups and support groups out there for you. Um, and that if you need help right now, speaking to a trusted adult within your school or within your family is the best thing that you can do. Because even if you don't know where to go, or you don't know the right places to go, I guarantee you there's someone within your school or within your community who you have that trusted relationship with that can direct you to the right place.
Fantastic. Deanna, we could talk about this topic with you all day. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure, and I really appreciate just contributing to the conversation around school-based mental health and academic pressures. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate that too. If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is email or LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Deanna Oliver is my name. And email is Deanna@psyflow.com. So that's DEANNA at PSYFLO.com.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.